There's a legend about the comedian W.C. Fields as he lay dying in his hospital bed, surrounded by his family. It was winter in New York City, and from the outside came the sound of newsboys shouting, "The stock market has crashed, the stock market has crashed." Stirred out of his stupor, Field signaled those assembled to his bedside, and he whispered, "Poor little urchins out there, undernourished, no doubt improperly clad. Something's got to be done about them. Something's got to be done." Then he dozed off. But seconds later, he opened his eyes again and said, "On second thought, screw 'em." Arthur Brooks uses this story to begin his op-ed piece in the New York Times, which he entitled, "To Make the World Better, Think Small." He was writing about the constant stream of tragic world events, the problems that we face in our world today that seem so large and so very intractable. And he was writing and talking to us about psychic numbing, where we throw up our hands in the face of tragedy. Paul Slovik of the University of Oregon shows that in his research that when events are large and remote, we so easily become insensitive to them. He uses the example that he says there was concern but hardly outpouring support for the Syrian refugees after 500,000 people died in that civil war. Adam Smith wryly observed the principle of psychic numbing 250 years ago. He wrote a book entitled Theory of Moral Sentiments, and he asked his readers 250 years ago, he said, imagine how a man of humanity in Europe would react to news of a dreadful earthquake in China, killing millions. He said, well, he may regret the calamity in theory, but so long as he never sees the victims, he will snore with the most profound security over the ruin of 100 million of his brethren. Arthur Brooks goes on to give us a solution to the psychic numbing that all of us can get ourselves involved in. He tells us that we are to think small. Now, he's not using bad math. What he's doing is reminding us that when it comes to people in need, 1 million is a statistic, while one person is a human story. He gives us 2 steps. He says the first step is to see individual faces in our own beliefs. And the second step is to move our ideals from politics and opinions into action. The way to do so is by finding a way to exercise our beliefs in the life of another person today, tonight, right now. Pope Francis believes in this principle. If you remember, when he concluded the Jubilee Year of Mercy, he exhorted all of us to forgive one person this very day. It's very easy for any person of any religious faith, facing the harsh global realities of today, to retreat and fall into cynicism. Arthur Brooks's answer, the Pope's answer, certainly might seem naive to many of us, but they call us to remember that it is well within my capacity, our capacity, to look with mercy on one person, and thus in that one person to see my own face. I crave forgiveness and love, but I get it by forgiving and loving others. Now, that first reading in our scriptures this evening is an extremely challenging reading for all of us as Christians. And all of us have to figure out how we respond to that in this very, very troubling time as our history in this nation unfolds. Share your bread with the hungry. Shelter the oppressed and the homeless. Clothe the naked when you see them. Do not turn your back on your own. And then Isaiah adds, then when we cry for help, the Lord will answer us. He says, do not turn your back on your own. Well, as Christians who have read the Scriptures know that our own is extended to everyone. For there is neither Jew nor Greek nor slave nor free in the eyes of Christ. So each one of us as reflective Christians, trying to struggle to live the message of the gospel, we all have to ask ourselves, how do we respond to this message in a world filled with so much darkness, so much fear, so much anger, so much mistrust, so much divisiveness right in the Christian community? How do we figure these things out without getting angry with one another? How do we dialogue to figure out how we're going to respond as Christians to take care of those who are truly in need and not become psychically numb because of the atrocities we see around us and the difficulties of figuring it all out, trying to find ways to fight terrorism and yet to be caring, compassionate, loving, forgiving people. It's so easy for all of us to be tempted to say what Fields said, screw them all. Or just believe that there's nothing at all that I can do in a world that simply seems to have gone crazy. There is. There always is. Arthur Brooks gives us this challenge. Pope Francis gives us this challenge. Jesus gave us this challenge 2,000 years ago. We start with one person and we do what we can. It can start in our own home and neighborhood, family. It can start right here in the parish with our Emmaus Health or dental services. It can start in our neighborhoods with the Samaritan Center and Catholic relief services struggling to help the refugees. It can start at the places of all of our places of work. Is there someone that I need to forgive? Is there someone I need to visit who is lonely and afraid? Is there someone that I've gossiped about that I need to stop gossiping about or bullying? Is there a dinner I need to make for someone who is a shut-in? Is there someone that I need to be more patient and compassionate towards? Do I need to be less judgmental of those who may have different beliefs or lifestyles than I have? What about the racism that exists in my own heart and how I treat those who look differently or act differently than I want them to look or act? You know, we may not be able to figure out all the horrific issues in Syria or the Middle East, but there are so many opportunities that each one of us can take on to be that salt of the earth, that light of the world. And this evening, I really believe that there's one very, very important task that we as adults need to accomplish, and that's to be an example to our young people, to guide them from a belief of entitlement to a life of commitment and sacrifice, to teach them tolerance, to teach them compassion, to teach them openness to the poor, the suffering, those different from us, to teach them how to welcome the stranger, to help them understand that we are all called to share our bread with the hungry, that we are all called to shelter the oppressed, we are all called to not turn our back on our own. Our young people need you and me to be models to them of how we struggle to live out this Christian command. The news is tough these days. The world we live in is so unsettled. Our nation is so divided today. But there's a much better response than simply screw 'em. We can't throw up our hands in the face of the difficulties around us. We're all being challenged by the events that are happening in our world, our nation, in our city, with the poverty and the violence that's happening all around us. Each of us can do our part. We are all called to be light and all called to be salt. Isaiah challenges us to remove from our midst oppression, false accusation, malicious speech. Not easy by any means, but this is the essence of what we say we are as Christians. In our very nation, at a time when there are so many different approaches to our issues, in a world of great anger and distrust and fear, we as Christians have to figure out how we will respond to the difficult message that comes to us from the Scriptures today. Do not turn our back on our own.